I lost him. I'm just going to start over a little bit. I didn't get too far into my session, so I'll go over the beginning stuff real quick. Now I lost my PowerPoint because I was closing down windows and panicking a little there. Let's put this over here. All right, so when I left everybody, where I wanted everybody to be was kind of our opening exercise, was to think about a student that you would dedicate this work to today. And I just asked folks to think, who is this and why did you choose them? And what are your hopes for this student's future? And we've got a small group here, and I know Jody, you were on in the beginning, and Des too. Do either of you want to share what you were thinking of now that you've had this extended time to think about it? Or Abigail, you're welcome to think about it and share as well.
Tanya, there's so many, so I guess it's not a lack of it's so many. So I've been doing this for a long time, so I think of many students over the years that and how we used to do things a little bit differently and how things have changed, and how so there's a lot of students I would dedicate this to. Probably those ones that it didn't work out so well, that I saw a lot of potential, but they wound up incarcerated or dead. So some of those sad situations.
Thank you, Abigail.
I have a student I've worked with for the past 4 years, a lot of challenging behaviors, a lot of trauma. I think about him a lot, and just hopes for his future is that, one, that he has a future. There's a lot of incarceration in his family, so I hope that he, has a positive future in his life and doesn't end up incarcerated or something like worse.
And I'm going to think about a student in the future. I'm going to think about the student who doesn't have a name yet, but who's sitting on the other side of a computer, missing that human connection, who desperately wants to get back to school, but can't, and is thankful for any time they get to see outside folks, whether it's teachers or other students. So as we're moving through this session, I want you to keep that student kind of in your peripheral vision. Mark or Des, do either of you want to share?
I can share. I have a student who, I'm a school psych at Paradise School. I did a lot of individuals with this kid, and he's really creative and smart, but he also struggles a lot with a lot of like internalizing and kind of school refusal type of behaviors. And he's found a pretty good home at Paradise, but I know that he struggles at home because he's not getting to school to see his buddies and stuff. So I definitely think about him in terms of a future student, because I know he's looking forward to the year and who he's going to see and what he's going to be able to do school-wise.
Thank you for sharing, really appreciate that. Mm-hmm. So this opportunity for us to kind of take a deep breath, especially after the little bit of a tumultuous start we had with the Zoom rooms not opening correctly, is an opportunity for us to just kind of center ourselves on the opportunity that lays before us, and that is to build our own capacity in social emotional learning so that we can be there and provide the support for our students. And this is where transformative social emotional learning kind of emerges. It's this idea that we are agents of change, and that this is a process, right? It's not a program. We heard Dr. Lane this morning talk about, different programs that people might be implementing as part of SEL. But the program in and of itself is not the social emotional learning component. It's the process where we're working with young people and with adults. It's an iterative process that emerges over time and allows us to create these lasting relationships. And recently, with all of the unrest and conflict around equity, right, the Castle organization has really looked at transformative SEL through the lens of equity. And so how do we not only be passively developing ourselves, but actively being agents of change? And I'm just maybe a thumbs up. How many of you have seen this graphic that kind of represents the work, right? Okay, so I see Abigail, you've seen this. Okay, so, you know, there is a lot of this that's already been out there, and especially as counselors and school psychologists, this is very known to you. But what I want to kind of talk about today is how do we move from the passive competencies of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, responsible decision-making, and relationship skills, and move into a more active framework that promotes equity among our students. Because we really do see that social emotional learning is a lever, a very important lever that will help us improve society, looking at it through an equity lens. So in your work, you've probably seen the description of self-awareness that I am jotting down for you, right? These are the ones that identify, you know, when we're thinking about being aware or teaching our students to be aware, the adult part of that is how in touch with our emotions are we? It is not just something, right, that we're doing for our students. We need to first create space for ourselves. And in looking at some of the resources that are out there for adult SEL, you know, there's this assumption that if we spend time working on the adult component, we might be doing that at the risk of not meeting the needs of our students. When really, this is not an either-or situation. It's something that's done in tandem. And the more that we as adults are identifying our emotions and linking our thoughts to feelings and being confident and feeling self-efficacy, that actually will be translated to our students. A study in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a school district in Tulsa, Oklahoma recently, as you may have heard, that, you know, that has been in the news, but they did a study of student perceptions, and they talked to these students about what makes you feel like you belong and what makes you feel as if your teacher is supporting you. And one of the #1 responses is that students feel a sense of belonging in classrooms where the adults are obviously feeling like they belong. In other words, we need to not just model, but be and actively demonstrate these 5 competencies, and then we will be credible and believable and create environments for our students where they can be and develop these 5 competencies. Now, these areas are what I'm going to refer to kind of as the older version of that graphic. And as we think about the lens of equity, right, we're adding to it where we are not just passively developing those pieces, but also integrating personal and sociocultural identities. So maybe we are aware of our emotions, but are we aware of also the other parts of our identity that take on an equity, take on or support an equitable approach, as well as analyzing the beliefs, my own mindsets and biases, so that I can be aware of them when I'm talking with folks about how that comes across. So the work that we've been doing isn't wasted work. It's all good. It's just we're taking it up and ratcheting it up a couple of notches to include that equity piece. As well as this idea of social interdependence, that our identities are interconnected. The second one is social awareness. So how are we using those identities to take the perspective and empathize with others? And you can see the list is kind of short as we're looking at social awareness in the old format, but as we start to add equity to that, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do bills, that was probably from an old slide deck. Recognizing not only where someone is coming from, but how the language that we use and the expectations that we hold, how they might set demands and or opportunities to our other colleagues, to other students. And I am guilty of using the collective we, right? When I'm talking with students, or even with adults, sometimes I'll use the collective we to represent what I believe is a common goal or a common interest. And really, the only thing we as adults or we as humans really know is our own identity. And so using that collective we is an assumption that really is at direct odds with taking others' perspectives and being able to build empathy. So being open and honest and upfront about the fact that I really don't know where your expectations are and your social goals, and those are something that we need to co-construct and collaborate on. Responsible decision making. I mean, this is a pretty generic process, right? You identify the problem, you look at the situation and you solve it, and then you determine how effective is your problem, and would you do anything different? Do you need to make changes? Sounds a lot like an MTSS framework. So when we're thinking about equity, the piece that we add to that is not just analyzing a situation, because when we analyze a situation, we tend to analyze it through our own perspective. But to be able to analyze situations and think about what are the individual and social impacts those situations have. Identifying problems that are social in nature, looking specifically at the societal piece. When we're looking at these situations or these potential problems, co-creating a sense of belonging for all members of our group. The fourth one is self-management. And right now, as adults, we are thinking about this new environment that we're going to put our students into, right? We've been working with face-to-face situations where we're looking at, how are we helping students be successful and manage their emotions, their feelings in the classroom. This remote learning takes on a whole new layer of situations and environments that impact students' ability to control their impulses or to manage stress that they didn't even know they had, or the freedom, the self-discipline to whether they want to sit in front of the camera or not, or pay attention or attend to whatever the task is, and what is motivating them, how are we helping them set goals. But when we're thinking about the equity piece, right, we're layering in, not just the organizational skills, but also the planning that goes along with it, and how are they taking this self-management and creating a personal and collective agency with it, that they can then, they see themselves as advocating for themselves and for others. And then finally, building relationships. communication and engagement, relationship building and teamwork have always been part of this, but then you layer on cultural competency and collaborative problem solving. So the role of social emotional learning has really kind of been prioritized and emerged up to the top of the list, so to speak, as we're looking at school districts and they're developing their plans for re-entry. Really, they need to think about this even more than ever, because our students are coming from a situation that many leaders are, that many social researchers are considering as a collective trauma, right? When you're thinking about the pandemic and what impact it's had on students, it is a toxic stress situation for many students. And so more than ever before, we need to build a trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive environment for all students, because we know of at least one that they all collectively share. And you know, the levels of engagement, it is a tall order that we are being asked to support, right? It's not just as adults in the classroom, but how are we supporting what we're doing in the classroom across the school? And it's not just what we're doing for our students, but as adults, how are we being that agent of change? And then also including the home and the community. So what I wanted to ask you to do is, as you think about those competencies and those pieces of the competencies, which one do you feel, which one do you feel is most in your wheelhouse, or you feel most prepared to not just work with students, but to model and to be, and you've done space or work in that area? And this is where I was mentioning to folks early, if they had a phone, they could go to menti.com and use the code 346075. Now we only have about 6 people on the call, so our word cloud's going to be kind of small, but I would, if you don't want to do the menti.com, I would be interested in what your response is in terms of which of these competencies or which of these elements of the competency do you feel it most poised to support for your students?
Tanya, did you want us to speak to that or type in something? I'm sorry, I missed where you wanted us to put that.
You know what? I had originally planned to do it as a word cloud, but there's only 6 of us, so we'll all have the same size word. It won't necessarily be able to do it. So I would appreciate some open conversation. What do you all, where do you see your strengths?
I've done a lot of work with multicultural understanding. I went back after my school counseling to get my certification as a teaching English as a second language, and just more to understand Latino culture, or all cultures, but in our school district, Latino culture, since they were showing a big discrepancy in academic and behavioral norms. And recently I'm getting my certification as an addictions counselor, and again learning about how different populations. So I like that idea that the collaborative we should not, no one should really use that. I can only speak from my perspective, and really trying to nail down and understand a student's perspective, whatever that may be. So I know you mentioned with responsible decision making that we should consider the social implications of decision making, but I also think that it's important to understand what is important for the child, what values their culture might, like my decisions are based on my values and because that's my world view and my lens. And so kind of understanding what values are driving this child's decision, and having an open conversation about where decisions come from, because we know the process, but what I feel may be very right for me may not translate well to a child. And I think that that may be part of the issue when we have some behavioral challenges maybe this fall, like what's important to kids and what, not only about COVID, but a lot of things that are going on in our country. So sorry for talking long.
No,
Yeah.
Abigail, I appreciate you lifting up those highlights in terms of, thinking about having those conversations with students and thinking about their reality and what their experiences have been. It can't be, in order for this work and this opportunity to learn and grow and co-construct with each other, it can't just be, if you're a counselor or a school psychologist, when the student comes to see you, right? This needs to be something that's consistent and pervasive with all of the adults. So when we're thinking about, like, who is the adult that is going to be, A, doing this work for themselves, and B, leading, supporting, and nurturing this work for students, where do you see your reality in terms of the adults that you work with? Are they poised to have those conversations or not?
We've been working a lot on restorative justice and a lot on collaborative problem solving, like Ross Green's model, and trying to get teachers to recognize that, behavior is not a choice, it's a communication tool. So stop telling me like, well, he's choosing to act like that. Yeah, for a reason. Like,
exactly.
There's something going on there and they're trying to tell you something, and trying to help them. I think where we are now, and the whole reason I was interested in this session, is trying to get them to identify their feelings and what they're bringing to that situation, and when they need to self-identify and say, I need to step out of this because I can't collaborate, I cannot problem solve with you right now because my emotional state isn't, so we're really working on that, getting teachers to recognize, we do it as an administrative team and as my emotional support team, the paraeducators and people who are tapping out all the time, we read each other and it's like, okay, tap out, like go, like you need to go right now. You're part of the problem. But trying to get everybody to recognize that that's not a weakness, that's a strength, to be able to say, I can't bring what this child needs right now, and I got to get out of the way and let somebody else, take that on. So
And I don't want to do any more harm, right? Because if I stay and I don't tap out, I may say something that is going to actually make our relationship worse than better, and cause harm to the student.
Well, and what we've said several times to the teachers is that's prioritizing your ego over theirs. And yours has had way longer to develop. Who are you to do that to a kid who's trying to establish that ego? Because you need to win. You need to be able to stick it out. You need to be tough enough to do it. That's prioritizing your ego and your needs over the child's need. And somebody has to be the adult.
Mark, did you want to
I was going to follow up what Megan said with just the self-awareness piece. I think that's sort of part of the strength I bring as a psych. And working with behaviorally challenged kids, I think that there's a lot of ambiguous territory that you get into, and the kids are bringing a lot of subtle stuff that they have a really difficult time understanding. So I think that you're kind of a reflective instrument to them to help them understand the impact that their behaviors and their feelings have on the world around them. So I think it's important, like Megan was saying, to kind of embrace like a humbleness about knowing when your ego is challenged, but also trying to maintain like an ability to reflect back to the child in a constructive way, retaining a relationship and being able to say, hey, and processing through some of the stuff that they're doing and helping them get more of an awareness of maybe why some of their ways of dealing with their behavioral needs are causing them failure and not success, or isolation and not connection with people around them.
I don't feel like we can underscore self-awareness enough in terms of moving this whole piece forward for our students to be successful. And how are we making space for that to happen for teachers? I appreciate, Megan, you here as a principal, and the fact that you're looking at this through the restorative practices model and getting teachers to connect and to reflect, because without that, we've got situations that are cropping up that are not going to end well because we're not in tune to that piece of our identity.
Well, and I think it's heightened right now. You know, you've got a lot of teachers that are very anxious about coming back in this environment, and, you know, bringing that to the table and having to have those conversations and say, like, you are entitled to every single one of those feelings, but you need to own them. You need to know where they are, and you need to know when they're impacting negatively, you know, the people around you. And, like, let's set up a plan for, you know, what you're going to do when you start to feel that way, so that you pull yourself out of that child situation, you know, and give yourself that time, because you have that right. You know, we all have to go through that, and everybody's entitled to those feelings. But, you know, really, I'm anxious about working through that myself, because I think I've got a lot of staff that are really heightened in an elementary school. You know, like, kids are going to sneeze on me. They're going to cough on me. They're going to be all over each other. How am I supposed to do hand over handwriting instruction when I can't get that close to a kid? And, you know, like,
Well,
so
and
getting
that's
everybody to recognize that's what they're bringing.
Well, and that's part of why I wanted to have this session today, was because here we are at the end of July. And if you look at the information that's coming out from Castle, or you look at some of the information that's coming out from Panorama, or just went out of my head. Really, the calendar to start this work for us as adults was probably back in June. Right? And so really thinking about, what are we doing to get our teachers ready for these conversations? I don't want to miss anybody who wanted to share, but I think you've kind of led right naturally into this idea that, you know, there is this roadmap that Castle has provided for us, and has identified critical practices. And one of the critical practices, critical practice number 2, is all about building the capacity for our adults. Where can the adults connect and heal and build their capacity? Because when you're working with a student, you know, Mark, as you were talking about that reflective piece. If we're reflecting, but we've got no gas in the tank to reflect with, that's when we're going to, that's going to increase the likelihood that we're going to need to tap out, right? That's going to increase the likelihood that that interaction with that student is not going to move in a positive direction. And so how are we, these are 4 of the recommendations in order to kind of develop this critical practice, is to allow the adults space for connecting and healing, and giving them access to mental health and trauma support, because they've been through this as well. They need to do the work first. And not just the social emotional piece, but also looking at holding that mirror up to themselves and thinking about, what are some of the practices they've been doing, and making sure that, you know, we're embracing innovation, embracing change, and embracing a space where equity is a priority. And it can't be once and done. It's got to be something that we come back around to repeatedly. And I've included some really good resources in here, because I feel like the whole month of July I've been doing nothing but watching webinars for adult SEL. And the executive director for Baltimore Public Schools has been working with our staff to help our staff actually have these conversations. Because I think something you had said, Abigail, when we are working with students, you had talked about the Latino student, even knowing what words to use that are not going to set up barriers for the student to hear what you're trying to do. You know, you heard us in the beginning of the day and beginning of each session, we always talk about one of the norms is coming with good intentions. Unfortunately, good intentions aren't always enough. Even though we want to have these conversations with kids and we want it to go well, if we haven't done the work ourselves, we're going to say things that may be misconstrued, or we're going to use language that may be culturally offensive to our students and not move it forward. This session is not really about an opportunity to tell you how to do everything, but rather to impress, right? The importance of how are we starting this work now? What are we doing in order to build the capacity of our staff? I had a couple activities in here. I'm looking at my time. Were we done at 10:30? We were, weren't we? So I apologize because of it, all of us.
I think we're done at 10:45, Tanya.
Oh, okay. Well, then I do have a little bit of time. I thought it was, okay, good. I have a little bit of time. So what I've done is I've gone in and pulled out some strategies to really center and mindfully become more aware of what we're feeling and thinking in order to kind of give you some jumping off points that might be helpful for your staff. One that I've been using throughout the sessions is the internal weather map. And this, there's an organization called Panorama, has a very large cache of free resources, but it also has a paid product, which, you know, that's obviously how our nonprofits are supported. But in several of the sessions that I've done with them, we've used this internal weather report. And really, it's just asking teachers whenever you're meeting with them, every single time, always kind of starting with some sort of centering activity and asking them, where are you at the start of this? Where is your internal weather map? And these are not necessarily the, I mean, these are only just a small snippet. I've created actually a Google slide that allows you, let me just show you, view. I don't know why I don't want, oh, I don't want grid view. That's what I want. I want master. No, I don't want master. These are actually stickers that you can cut and paste into another slide when you're working with staff, and they can actually move them in, or you can and use these as a jumping off point for staff when you're asking them questions on Zoom. But it's not the random request. It's the fact that whatever we do, we start to build a routine of every single time we get together, we start with some sort of centering activity that puts us in touch of where we are. I know that as a supervisor, I am sometimes guilty of launching into a meeting with, okay, here's the agenda. Boom, 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 boom. Here's all the things that we need to complete. And realizing that I'm not stopping and saying, wait a minute. Where are you when you walk into this meeting? What is your state? So that's one activity that if you go to actually this roadmap and choose the critical practice 2, there are several other kinds of activities that you can do that allow you to create this space. And, you know, I know that sometimes we are so limited in the time that we have when we're working with adults that we're like focusing on the kids, right? We're like, we've got this student we need to discuss and we need this data we have to look at. But if we're not taking time to address the adults in the room and help their social emotional awareness and self-management, they're not going to then turn that around and be that person for our students. So how are we as leaders in the school promoting this space? Another activity that I know that our staff had done when we were working specifically in equity, but thinking about identity, right? When we're thinking about our self-awareness and our self-management, is to think about 3 words that identify you, that you identify with, your 3 words that describe your identity. I want you to think about that for a second. And in the chat, just drop in 3 words that describe you and your identity. So I'm going to move the chat over so I can see. This is a very shortened version of this activity, but when you think of yourself, how do you see yourself? What would be the top 3 ways you describe your identity? Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Abigail. Thank you, Jody. Thank you, Mark. I know you've done this, Des, so you can hold off. As you look at those, what doesn't come out in your identity are some of the most obvious, or when we're thinking about SEL as a lever for equity, the dominant trait. I noticed none of you said white, or none of you said, now mom and wife would be as close to gender as we would get, right? Because we are sharing some of our more hidden attributes. But when we're thinking about our identity and being self-aware, we sometimes forget about some of the identities that will be the most necessary to unpack when we're working with our students, right? And it's interesting that none of you identified the more dominant traits. Now, whether it is white, whether it is educated, whether it is teacher or educator, right? We tend to put forth the adjectives that will phrase us in a very, and this is not meant to criticize, but we're putting forth the identities that we feel most proud of. And why, Megan, did you take that away? You know what? And
I don't really, I think because I feel like those are the given and those are the observable, and I went for the non-observable, more the intangible qualities, figuring that's kind of what we've been talking about. But that's where I started. And I was like, wait a minute. Like,
well, and there are students who will see their culture as their most important. But we as adults, well, as humans that are part of the dominant culture, we tend to not worry about that, not prioritize that, because we don't have to. We've never had to feel that that was something we needed to assert for ourselves. So even getting teachers to really unpack, so you start with these 3, but then you kind of dig in with teachers and talk about, like, what are your other identities that are impacting the decisions that you make, the comments or the experiences that you've had. I'm going to share just one more with you. Right, when actually I'm going to jump down here to 3 signature practices. Tulsa, Oklahoma, I mentioned them earlier. There is a Castle webinar. They did a series of 5 webinars over the summer, and they did a whole webinar on adult SEL, and they brought some educators in from Tulsa who have really, you know, they've kind of been elevated to a position right now in society as being an area of very diverse beliefs and unrest and conflict. And the school district that's situated there, they contextualize a lot of what has happened, because back in the 1800s, there was actually a massacre of the Black folks in Tulsa for, and it was very traumatic. And so as a result of that little known event that really hasn't been shared, it has had great impact on the way in which the races interact in Tulsa. And so one of the, they have made a concerted effort in the wake of all of the, not just with George Floyd, but some things that have happened prior, to really develop more culturally responsive practices in the school. And they recognized that they needed to start with the adults, just like we were talking about here. And so they used a strategy called 3 signature practices. And these signature practices are part of every meeting. They're part of every board meeting. They're part of every classroom. They're part of every staff meeting, faculty meeting, parent meeting, right? It starts with some sort of welcoming activity that includes everybody in the room. It's routine. It doesn't have to take long. Now ours took a little longer because I had some Zoom issues, but that's where I asked you to think about dedicating what you were going to do right now to a student. We took some time to unpack it. Just because we took time to unpack it doesn't mean every inclusion activity needs to take a long time. But they really wanted to work on everyone feeling a sense of belonging. So it became one of their signature practices. Second is, whenever you're meeting, is to engage all voices, right? Make sure everybody has an opportunity to be heard. Now, we kind of did that with the word. We didn't do a word cloud, right? But we talked about the connection and where you saw your strengths were in the competencies. And then whatever you do when the meeting is done, end it with some sort of optimistic closure that gives folks hope and looking forward in a positive light. And I didn't do that with you yet, but it's coming. And the one I would ask you to do, and I'm 2 minutes over my time, so I'm going to let you go, but I'm going to leave you with the optimistic closing, which is something you would do as a result of this session. And it might simply be look at all of the resources or read the Castle SEL roadmap, but I just want you to think about, and I'm going to stop talking for a sec, something you will do as a result of this session. And you don't have to tell me, but you can write it on your graphic organizer. In the interest of time, I'm not going to ask you to share, but I hope you all walk away with something that you're going to do, right? And I appreciate your attention and your patience as we work through the Zoom issue. So please have a great day. I hope you have enjoy your short break. I'm sorry it's a little shorter than it was last time. Take care.